Ave Gratia Plena. On Painting After Postmodernism by Benjamin F. Patterson. Preface and Acknowledgements. After a century in abeyance, there has been a resurgence of classical training in the art of painting. Modernism and postmodernism have run their course, and artists have now begun to retrace their steps in search of another path forward. Though it remains a live question what of spiritual or historical seriousness can be done with the ancestral craft today, when modernism has brought the history of art to a close, and postmodernism has seemingly foreclosed any prospect of reopening it. When I began this book back in 2015, I did not have an answer to this question. But after several years and hundreds of fruitless, rambling pages, a clear and distinct idea came into focus. Within a year, I produced a rough draft, which was self-published prematurely in 2020. After several additional years of redacting the manuscript, I am relieved to present the third and, God willing, final edition. It is necessary that academic painters grapple with their place in art history, because good craftsmanship alone will not suffice to make a masterpiece today. The most highly skilled academic art was hounded in the 20th century by charges of kitsch, and not only out of prejudice, but also because a changing context had changed its meaning. The rules of the craft were still being reproduced by academic artists, but only rarely its essence, as a substantial change had taken place underneath the accidents of fine craftsmanship. Gone was the life that animates the works of Titian and Michelangelo, and gone was the soul by which fine art transcends the soullessness of mimesis. Art's form became like an empty shell, its function having changed at a remove from the medieval origins of the craft. In the 19th century, the emergent order of liberal society had no use for art made to worship God, to honor a monarch, or to illustrate classical mythology. As official patronage declined and fine art became a commodity like any other to be bought and sold by anyone who could afford it and had the taste to appreciate it, its traditional purposes were replaced by the aestheticizing objectives of self-expression and art for art's sake, which dignified bourgeois, democratic art by dressing it up in the embroidered vestments of a displaced religion of high culture, and eventually capitulated in the course of the 20th century to the baser purposes of money and politics, as fine art was integrated into the mechanical operation of the neoliberal world order. The craft tradition of classical painting and sculpture died because it had lost its raison d'être, and it does not appear that anything has changed for the better in the condition of society to give the craft tradition a new lease on life. Nothing of any importance will be produced today by following Daumier's proverbial recommendation to be of one's time. The disordered form of modern art was the harbinger of society's present abandonment to a disordered way of life and a distorted view of reality. If the restoration of the art of painting is to have any greater significance, then it must portend the restoration of society. The artist of tradition has a vocation to stand apart from the postmodern world and to be a voice of spiritual transcendence and humane critique, the need of which is more exigent now than ever before. The pressing task which calls the classical painter out of his obsolescence is to resume his traditional functions. Although there is no stage comparable to the Paris salons where the French academicians exhibited their great history paintings, the practice of the old craft need not be a public spectacle to accomplish its purpose. In medieval times, when Cimabue painted his celebrated Madonnas and Giotto painted his crucifixions, painting was an act of worship performed in union with the holy sacrifice of the Mass, addressed in the first place to God and only secondarily to the faithful. Now that the classical painter has lost his employment as a performing monkey, delighting crowds with tricks of mimicry, painting may become a thing of world historical significance again, as a liturgical labor, both literally and metaphorically speaking. The painter's urgent calling is a priestly vocation to make propitiation on canvas for the culture's sins against beauty, a prophetic vocation to speak the truth about the culture's lies, and even a royal vocation to rebuild the kingdom of God atop the culture's ruins. To make this argument is as much a rhetorical challenge as a logical one. It requires telling a story which is more compelling than either modernism's linear narrative of revolutionary progress or postmodern skepticism of grand narrative. Like any account of the history of art, my story has a narrative structure, a plot consisting of a causally connected sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Hence, the book is subdivided into 3 parts. In Part 1, we will retrace the roots of Renaissance art across several developments of the High Middle Ages, including the Mendicant movement, medieval Aristotelianism, and Petrarchan humanism. In Part 2, we will investigate the causes of art's death in the early to mid-20th century, with a focus on Romanticism and on the Enlightenment. In Part 3, we will address the present context for the revival of the ancestral craft of painting, and consider some of my own work, which I present as a model for what other artists ought to be doing today. The book is preceded by an essay on the theory of art, which is rather dense and makes for a forbidding way to begin. For most readers, it may be best to skip to the introduction and return to the prefatory essay by and by. It should not be overlooked entirely, however, since it introduces key philosophical ideas which recur throughout the book. Modern art having been designed to express the implications of modern philosophy, one objective of the book is to determine what went wrong with modern philosophy. There being no more incisive critique of the modern philosophical tradition than its very own critique of itself, I defer to Martin Heidegger and Jacques Derrida. Both were able critics of the Enlightenment, and Derrida in particular, as an authority lately recognized by the postmodern art world, makes for effective ammunition against the art world. Postmodern philosophy is a wrecking ball that may be used to tear down the edifice of modernism. The theoretical scaffolding by which classical art will be raised again will naturally come from classical philosophy and from Catholic theology, the once and future queen of the arts and sciences. To reinvent the fine arts when they have been destroyed by the agnosticism and immanentism of modernism, the straightest path is to study Aristotle and Aquinas. The route to a renewal of the fine arts passes through religion, and not just any religion, but the one, holy, Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Jesus Christ. Catholics invented the tradition of Renaissance painting to adorn the Church, and it is Catholics who will revive it for the purpose of rebuilding a church which has fallen into ruins. The very task which God once upon a time called on St. Francis to perform, setting the rebirth of classical art in motion as the mendicant orders began building churches and decorating them with paintings, including the earliest works of Giotto di Bondone. The history of art is not a pagan tragedy fated to end in the grim death of art, but follows a providential logic. History has a narrative structure because God is its author. As Dante Alighieri recognized, it takes the form of a comedy, insofar as the story that God writes is redemptive, always ending not in death, but in resurrection. Though addressed to artists, the book is intended like a Renaissance treatise for a wider audience. In the spirit of a more modern genre, the book assumes the form and tone of a manifesto, lapsing at times into hyperbole, polemic, and grandiosity, for which I must beg my readers' indulgence. With a nod to Dante, I also include a number of autobiographical anecdotes which have been lightly fictionalized. I want to extend a special thanks to Jerome Marion, Esquire, without whom this project would never have begun, to my uncle J.D. Patterson for generously assisting in its original publication, and to all who have contributed invaluable support, especially my parents, Joseph and Elizabeth Patterson.